J Knights, and welcome back to the What the Austen podcast. And it's spooky season! Yay! I'm so excited. This is my favourite season, so super chuffed about it. And I also love it because the 2 episodes that come out in October are this one that I'm doing today with Martha, which is when we cover one of Catherine Morland's reads, and then the other one is Villanoff. So it's a good month for the podcast for sure. But today, the book that we've decided to cover this year is The Monk by Matthew Lewis, which is another book that's mentioned by Catherine and John Thorpe and Isabella in Northanger Abbey. So this is a really fun one. So last year we did Mysteries of Udolpho, which was a crazy but fun read, and I loved that. And this year we're doing The Monk, which has been a crazy, not quite so fun, a little bit traumatic read. But yeah, so before we get into it, I just want to put a trigger warning out there. There is going to be conversations about sexual assault in this because that's quite a heavy theme of the book. So yeah, I just want to let people know that before we get going. If that's something that's obviously going to be distressing to you, I don't want you to tune into this episode. But yeah, Martha, welcome back.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So I think our plan is to run through this like we did the Mysteries of Udolpho episode, right? We're just going to go chronologically through the book and share our thoughts.
Yeah, so I didn't really know what to expect going into this book. And it may be like the oldest full novel I've read. Just thinking because it was published in like 1796, which is obviously quite an old book. Obviously, I really love Austen and that sort of time period, which is a little bit later. Now I'm not remembering there were Mysteries of Udolpho was, but I think it was a very similar era. And it was very like exciting first volume. Like I was really, really invested in the book, and I thought the characters were really interesting. And it's set in Madrid, so it was kind of an area of history that I haven't really read about, like in terms of like literature. And it's really interesting the way that these Gothic writers in that period were not setting their books in England. Say with Mysteries of Udolpho, that one's set in Italy. So I thought the setting was really interesting, and it kind of launches like straight in to some of the characters. There's not a lot of preamble, and we meet Leonella, who was absolutely hilarious, and her niece Antonia. So like I found the first couple volumes brilliant, and then the third one, it just went off the rails, I think, a little bit.
Oh my God, no, I was the same. So when we started it, I was like messaging you like, oh my gosh, this is so fun. Because I was like really getting Mysteries of Udolpho vibes, which at times was like hilarious. And I think actually the first volume of this in parts was actually funnier. Like especially with her aunt at the start. We'll get into like the content obviously as we talk through this, guys. But yeah, the first volume was really funny. The second volume wasn't necessarily distressing. It was just like, it started to get a lot more like supernatural and like kind of like magical. And then yeah, the third volume, it just went like 0 to 100 real quick and got very dark, to the extent that I was like, yes, there's Gothic novels in the terms like you have like dark castles and you have like supernatural elements, but this was like beyond Gothic. This was just like dark and disturbing in the third volume.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was really enjoying it early on, and by the end I was a bit like, I don't know if I like this book anymore. I'm not. It was like making me. It was very uncomfortable read, I think, the third volume. And there's a lot of things about like sin and like good versus evil and those types of things. And there was a conclusion, but I wasn't that satisfied with how it all kind of came together. I feel like the good characters, some of the good characters suffered a lot more than some of the bad characters, which I found difficult.
I love that you said that, actually, because when I was reading it, I was like, I don't really know where Lewis falls on this. Like, I actually found it really confusing. I was like, is he against the Catholic faith? Is he trying to uphold it? Is he just, I don't know. It was really strange. I kind of felt like it was leaning more towards that he was against it. But then when it came to anything else that was outside of the Catholic faith, that also wasn't so great either. It was confusing. It was like, this is sinful, but also, is that the fault of the Catholic Church that people are pushed to sin? But it was like, but if you do sin, you still suffer. So I was like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think I got the impression that he was against the Catholic Church, which would make sense, him being English and England being a very Protestant country at that time. And kind of how they have these kind of figures in the Catholic Church and in lots of religions, but where the monk, Ambrosio, which I thought was hilarious because it kept making me think of the custom. Like how he was so like revered by everyone around in Madrid and in the monastery where he lived, but actually deep down he wasn't a good person, and he wanted to keep those secrets from everyone. And also how he convinced himself that what he was doing was okay and that he could just repent and it would all be fine. But obviously that isn't how it turns out in the book. He can't repent that, and actually everything he does is so far beyond redemption that it's good that that's not the fix. It isn't, oh, I can just confess and it will be fine.
Yes. Yeah. There was definitely like an emphasis that like authority figures in the Catholic Church are like really not very nice, because it was also the same that there was like the head nun. She was also not very nice either. I think it'd be good to kind of explain how Ambrosio is introduced to us. So when we start out the book, we're introduced to a few characters. We're introduced to Lorenzo, Antonia. What's the aunt called? Antonia's aunt?
Leonella,
and then we've got Lorenzo's friend, who's not in it that much. I don't know if his name's that significant. Do you remember his name?
I want to say Raymond.
No, Raymond's the guy later. Raymond's the guy who's with Agnes. I can't remember what his friend's name is, but that's okay because he's not that significant. He's a funny guy, but yeah, he doesn't need a name. It's okay. So Lorenzo sees Antonia and Lorella. They're coming into the church, and the church is packed. So there's tons of people in there, and everyone's like, "Why is it so busy?" And it's because words got around about Ambrosio being this like incredible monk who really like preaches the best sermons, even though he's only done like 2 or 3 in the past. He's like renowned for being this incredible person and like the chosen person that people go to for confessions. He's basically famous in Madrid at this point. And so they happen to cross paths because Antonia and her aunt are looking for a seat, and they end up sitting next to Lorenzo and his friend. Yeah, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, so they sit down and they get to talking, and Leonella and Antonia are kind of new coming back to Madrid. So Antonia's mother, Elvira, who we haven't met yet, but we do meet not that further along, she's not very well, so they've come back. But she originally was from that area, and she married someone without the permission of the family, and they were basically cut off. So her husband has passed away, and they come back trying to reach out to her brother-in-law to be like, she knows she's dying and she wants support for her daughter when she dies from the family. So that's why they come back. And she's starting to meet these characters and the different people in the town, and then they're new to Madrid, so they're like, why is everyone here? What are all these people doing in this church? It's so busy. And they hear the monk speak, and they're really impressed with him. But they also make friends with Lorenzo and his friend. And Leonella, the aunt, who I thought was hilarious, is convinced that one of them wants to marry her. So she's never been married, and she's obviously older. And the guy was just like, where has she got this from? Like, why does she think this? I've spoken to her for like 5 minutes today.
Yeah, she was literally like, you're going to come around and propose to me? And he was like, no. Like, who are you? She's like, I know you're in love with me. It's so funny. And what's hilarious is Antonia in comparison is like beautiful. Like, she's described as kind of like mesmerizing. Lorenzo basically falls instantly in love with her.
Yeah, and then he goes around to visit, doesn't he, and meets her mother as well. But her fear is that Antonia would follow a similar path to herself, so she's not keen on Lorenzo pursuing her daughter unless he has the permission of his uncle, who is like the Duke of Medina, I think he was. So he's quite an important person, but she's adamant that unless he has that permission, she doesn't want Antonia ending up in the same position where they get exiled because they haven't followed the rules of the family.
Yeah, 100%. And when they're in the church and Ambrosio walks through the door, everybody, like we said, was completely mesmerized, particularly Antonia, she sees him and she almost has like this familiarity with him where she kind of recognizes him, but more that she recognizes something in herself about him, or at least she thinks that she recognizes something in herself when she looks at him, because people describe him as being really innocent. Chastity's like super important when like you're a monk, and that's really emphasized in the book as well. And she recognizes her innocence when his innocence is described. And basically, yeah, he leaves. We meet some other people. But Lorenzo spends some time pondering over the fact that he's basically convinced he wants to marry Antonia, even though they've literally just met. He's like mesmerized by her, wants to marry her. And he's like wandering around the church, and he falls out with his friend, doesn't he? Like him and his friend get into like a dispute. They like fall out, and then he falls asleep and has the wildest dream about Antonia. She's in like a wedding attire, and she's like a bride. And then this monster comes and grabs her. And I just thought this was the wildest thing. The guy having like a full-on fever dream. This monster comes and grabs her and like drags her away. But then she escapes and turns into like an angel. And he wakes up like totally freaked out. Like, what on earth is I just seen? Like, what is going on? And in the process also sees somebody in the shadows leaving a letter, which becomes important later on. I think one of the main things to emphasize about this book is everybody's intertwined some way, and we eventually find out how. But yeah, so that happens, which I see is one of the first like supernatural elements. I feel like that's the first. There's a lot of foreshadowing in the book, and that's the first sign of foreshadowing, I would say. The fact that he has these like prophetic dreams where he's like, oh my gosh, what is this? Yeah, but that scene just like mad. I couldn't believe it. And it was like right off the bat, I was like, gosh, we're not messing around here. This is a gothic novel.
Yeah, and that was a really, like you said, like that was the first bit of foreshadowing we had, which we actually have a lot of in the book. So Leonella and Antonia meet a gypsy, and Antonia's really like determined that she wants her future read, and she does, and it's not a very happy future to be read. And actually the gypsy is correct, and that's kind of how it plays out for her. And there's similar things with her mum and her dreams of her mum later on in the novel. So there's so much foreshadowing, and actually it's a very clever novel. It pieces together really well at the end, and there's a lot that goes on. It's just the end was very dramatic and a lot to read.
Yeah, it was just like mad. What was so funny when they went to see the fortune teller is what she said about her aunt. She was like, no amount of makeup will help you. Stop focusing on men. You need to focus on God because you're not going to get a man. I was dying. I was like, oh my God, that's brutal. Yeah, so basically Antonia's fortune is something along the lines of that she is going to attract somebody in who's going to be like this horrible predator. That she's like her beauty and her innocence will draw in somebody who's not very nice at all. And at this point, we don't really know who that is. But considering the book's called The Monk, I kind of had like an idea that it might be him, but I wasn't sure. And then how things start to play out after this point. So we kind of shift timelines back to Ambrosio at this point, right? And we start seeing things from his perspective. And the first vibe I got from him, so Ambrosio is the monk. He is very conceited, very prideful because everybody is been adoring him. And he's so famous in Madrid now. It's basically gone to his head. And he's just like a little bit narcissistic, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I would fully agree. And I think part of that comes from kind of his backstory. So we find out that he was kind of adopted by the monastery, like he was left quite young. And was just left there, and he's never left it apart from to attend the church, but which is still within the same area. So he's never left this space. So he's not really got much of a concept of the outside world beyond religion and the monastery and his belief in God. So I think the celebrity status that he gets without even leaving where he lives basically really, really gives him that kind of sense of importance, which he wouldn't have had before then.
Yeah, I think what's interesting as well, like he talks about, I feel like it's really shown how enforced like a vow of chastity is. And he's like talks about the fact that I think someone even mentions that like he wouldn't know the difference between a man and a woman, like biologically, because that's how like undriven he is by sexual desires, which obviously unravels dramatically. But yeah, he's almost seen as like the perfect monk. But he has a friend, also an apprentice at the monastery as well, and that is Rosario. So Rosario turns up on the scene, and they're like good friends. I'd say Ambrosio even kind of considers him like a son in a way. Do you not think? Like he's kind of like, I don't know, like I know they call each other like father, son, and everything, but he's like very caring towards him, and he's like, how can I help you and everything. And Rosario says that his friend's ill and he really wants Ambrosio to pray on it. So this is the first time we're introduced to him. And I wasn't actually sure how significant this person would be, but oh my god, does this person become significant? I was a whirlwind just with this one character, I swear to God. So I feel like it's not long after this that they go to the garden together. And Rosario starts saying about how he has this sister, Matilda, and how Matilda fell in love with this man, but it was totally unrequited, and he just kicks her out of the house, and she was devastated. And Ambrosio's like to Rosario, he's like, I'm so sorry, that's so terrible. And Rosario's like, well, feel sorry for me because I'm going through the same thing. Ambrosio has no idea what he's talking about. And then, out of nowhere, Rosario's like, actually, I'm a woman. And Ambrosio's like, what? Like, what is going on here? Not only am I a woman, I'm also Matilda, who I was just talking about, and I've been obsessed with you forever. You're actually the unrequited love that I have. I've basically been stalking you for months because I'm obsessed with you. Please don't let me leave. Like, please don't make me leave. And Ambrosio's like, what just happened? And we're reading it like, what just happened?
Yeah, and from that point, his biggest concern is immediately, oh well, you have to leave because it's my reputation. People think of me as this person, and actually, you can't be here because you will ruin that reputation. So his immediate reasoning is himself and how people view him. So I think Matilda makes him promise that he won't make her leave the order before she reveals her secret, and then he's immediately like, oh, but I'm more important and I can't do this. Like, he's like, it's not you, I think you're lovely, but I need to protect myself and the monastery and people's opinions of us.
Yes. Yeah, he's so fixated on his reputation. Like, it's super important to him. And that only gets worse. The more that he spirals, the more the lack of control that he has over his reputation, the harder he fights for it and the worse he gets. Like, his actions become worse and worse because he's trying to hold on to this reputation so much. And Matilda just starts going really weird at this point. So is it at this point that she starts like throwing herself on him?
Yes, yeah. And also, I think before this point, we've met Agnes, who is the sister of Lorenzo and one of the nuns in the nunnery that's linked to the monastery.
Yeah,
and
this is important.
When Lorenzo has his weird fever dream in the church, he sees someone leave a letter, and then he watches the nuns come through, and his sister is the one that collects the letter. And it turns out that she has had an affair with someone, and they're hoping to marry, so she's hoping to get out of her bonds of being a nun. And she's found out that she's pregnant, and the head of the nunnery, she's spoken to Ambrosio about this, and he basically was like, well, you need to punish her in the harshest way. And then he starts to feel bad for that, but because he's worried that people will look into him if he backtracks on his view, he basically leaves her to suffer and doesn't intervene in any way with what the nuns decide to do, because he thinks if he then says to them, oh, show mercy, they might be like, why have you changed your mind? And start looking into him now that he knows that Matilda's actually a woman and not a guy called Rosario.
Yes, and he actually finds the letter as well, reads it, and Agnes is being like dragged away screaming like, you will suffer for this. Like, she actually says to him, another sign of foreshadowing, is she says to him like, wait until you fall off your pedestal, because you will. And because he's saying to her like, she's so disgraceful because she like had sex and got pregnant and everything. Obviously she's a nun and things, and yeah, he's really harsh with her and sends her to the nuns who are really cruel. And yeah, she's like, just you wait, because you showed me no mercy, and no mercy will be shown to you when you fall off your pedestal. And so we're back to Ambrosio and Matilda in this garden, and Matilda, Ambrosio says to Matilda, you need to leave in 3 days because I can't bear to be around you. Like, you're going to ruin the reputation of everyone. And then because she starts declaring her feelings for him, he becomes more uncomfortable, and he starts to be conflicted between actually desiring Matilda and still wanting her to leave. This is like the start of his like downfall. He starts to be like so conflicted about it. Then Matilda, being like super crazy, pulls out a dagger and says, if you're going to make me leave, I'm going to just like unalive myself right now. And he's like, no, what are you doing? Instead of unaliving herself, she just like rips open her top with the dagger. So she's like exposed to him. And he's just there like, what has happened? But also, I kind of desire you now. This was the weirdest scene, honestly. I could not believe it. I was not expecting her to do that at all.
No, it was completely like wild. It's come from Rosario, who was quite quiet and kind of unassuming, to then like revealing the true character of Matilda. And there's a really interesting reveal about Matilda at the end of the book, which I'm sure we'll get to. But I thought that bit was really interesting. And again, for him, he's like, oh, I'm desired. So his desire for her comes from her wanting him. So it's all about how people view him and his kind of view of himself and the way that he's built himself up in his head and the way that he's celebrated in the city of Madrid.
Yes, because he's literally there just like, oh, this is so incredible that somebody would sacrifice their whole life to come and join me in the church just so they could be around me. And that like just really gets to him. He's like, oh, this is amazing. Like somebody's this infatuated with me. And she is. I mean, she's fully infatuated with him. In her just ripping open her top is not the weirdest part, because then there's a snake in her top. There is a snake, right, in her top that bites Ambrosio. I kid you not, right? That not the weirdest thing you've ever heard? And I get that there's like links between that in like the Garden of Eden and everything, but that was like such a left wing. I was like, that was a curveball. I wasn't seeing that coming. There's a snake in her top.
Yeah, so yeah, that was very kind of like Garden of Eden vibes, wasn't it? Like the temptation, and clearly it kind of foreshadows the fact that he will be tempted because the snake bites him. He's then left poisoned and they're worried that he's going to die, and because Matilda kind of re-puts on her disguise, I guess, they leave Rosario with the monk when he's resting, and the doctors basically said he's got 3 days to live. But he then miraculously recovers, and I think Matilda like sucks the poison out of him and like into herself, and she's then dying. And then when he says, oh, I can't believe, I don't want you to leave me, she's like, actually, I have some magical way to save myself. I'm going to go down to the vaults and do some weird magic.
Oh my god. No. So backtracking just slightly. So yeah, she's like looking after him and she's like playing the harp. This gave me such like siren. It gave me the vibes that I think some people see Mary Crawford as. You know, she's there playing the harp. She's like this kind of temptress siren person that like is drawing this church man in. And also something really interesting as well, that the fact that 3 comes up all the time is like usually like 3 days to die. That keeps popping up. Now 3 in like spirituality, like angel numbers, is actually a really positive number. It basically is the master builder number, and it's about being on like a divine path, or divine intervention is playing a part in your life. Now something really interesting about this book is often things that are considered divine usually are flipped on their head, and you see them, it's like corrupt and dodgy. And that's interesting about this as well. Like that number comes up all the time and it's flipped on its head, and it's like 3 days to die. It's like nothing positive, and it's not a divine path. It's like the opposite of a divine path. It's tragic. And so I just thought that was super interesting. That it was always coming up with like the number 3, like that is always 3 days to die.
Yeah, it comes up so often. It comes up multiple times in the book, or kind of 3 days until this will happen, and all those sorts of things. And I think that's such an interesting point, because it really is kind of flipping what the ideas of morality are on their head within the whole book.
Yes, 100%. And you're right, at this point now it kind of gets weird, because Matilda not only is just Matilda obsessed with Ambrosio, this like temptress female, she actually turns out that she grew up with a guy who was practicing witchcraft, and she picked up like some of his like skill sets and like got like a little book from him and stuff. And somehow she's like a master of this at this point, is able to go down to the vaults, which she does take Ambrosio as well. And on the way down, they bump into the nuns, who are talking about the way that they're like making Agnes suffer for the fact that she's like pregnant and everything. And Ambrosio has a bit of a moral conscience at this point, and he goes, oh my gosh, like I should go and stop this. And Matilda says to him like, no, because if you go and stop this, they'll be asking like, why you were down here, and people start looking into us. And he is so quick. He has like these moments of like a moral conscience, and then suddenly it's like, no, you're right. We'll do the bad thing again. I'm just like, this guy is shocking.
He's so easily tempted after like spending his whole life in the monastery, not having gone anywhere, to being like, oh, I should probably save this like woman. Oh wait, you're right. Let's just leave her to her fate. And
Right.
also when they go down into the vaults, when they see the nuns, Matilda basically doesn't fully get him involved in any of the weird witchcraft stuff yet. She tells him that he's not allowed to come down, and he sees like flashing of lights and like basically hears like thunder, and then she comes back and she's healed, and he kind of doesn't think that much about it until later on when it comes up again to benefit him.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yeah, the guy's so selfish. Honestly, it's so bad. I just want to emphasize as well, like, I really don't like the vibe where in this book, witchcraft is only seen as like baneful. It's only like bad. It's only like, it's considered kind of like an antichrist situation, which I know for some people that's how they see it and everything. But yeah, it's kind of put in opposition to Christianity, which is not the way that I see witchcraft, but there we go. But yeah, it's seen as like something like it's to do with the devil and all sorts of very traditional views on witchcraft, which very much is fitting for the time that this was written. People are still very paranoid about this kind of thing, and it was seen as kind of like the opposite of Christianity. In fact, anything that was not Christian was often considered pagan and was kind of shunned as being dangerous and corrupt. So that's definitely emphasized in this book. Like, Matilda is this kind of like crazy witchy character who does all this like terrible stuff in are they called crypts?
Yeah,
She does all this crazy
crypts and as vaults. I don't
really crypts in the vaults. So weird. And yeah, this is where she like does all this work, these rituals, which then heals her. And so yeah, you're so right though. They carry on with life, and he doesn't even think twice about the fact that she's healed. But also, I love that he's like not even that. He was like kind of fussed that she'd sucked the venom out of him, but then again was also like, oh, but it's me, so yeah, thank goodness you saved me, because this would be tragic. And that from this point on, they continue to have sex for a little while. Yeah, they're just like getting it on all the time until he suddenly goes off her, and I can't remember why this is.
I think he starts to doubt the choices he's made, and there's a bit where he's obsessed with this painting of the Madonna, and it turns out that actually the Madonna in his painting is Matilda. Like, she snuck in this painting of herself so that he would like be obsessed with this image. So at one point when he gets like frustrated with what's going on and he starts to doubt himself, he like breaks the painting and he's like, I don't want to obsess over this anymore. But part of the reason he goes off her is I think he meets Antonia again, and he's then interested in her, and he starts visiting for the first time, like leaving the house, doesn't he, to visit her sick mum. And I think she comes to ask him, doesn't she, like, will you pray for my mother? And he's like, yeah, oh, I'll come to your house because I think you're attractive. But he doesn't say that. So he breaks his vows of not leaving the monastery and like sneaks out at night to go and visit her and her mum at their house.
Yeah, it's interesting. He really casts Matilda aside when he sees Antonia, because Antonia for him just represents all this innocence and purity, which is obviously what he's no longer. And Matilda is obviously very much the opposite as well, because you know, she was really desperate for them to get it on. Like, she was pretty much adamant. There was no saying no to her. She was up for it. And I mean, he obviously was also, because he was tempted so easily. But yeah, Antonia represents everything that Matilda's not. And as soon as she comes around, he starts to fixate on her. But I love that he brought up that bit about the Virgin Mary painting. When Matilda was like, I had a painting commission and that's it. I wanted it to be here because I wanted you to start like fantasizing about me. And I'm just like, what? That is some serious calculated shiz, that is. My God. But who goes that far? And what's weird is he was fixated on the image, was looking at it all the time, felt desire when he looked at it, but didn't put two and two together until she said. This is like such a running theme of this book. People do not recognize people. It's strange.
It's so often that they're like, oh, I saw this woman and then like a few chapters later, they're like, "Oh, it's my sister." Like, how do they don't know who these people are? And I just think it's really funny, and that kind of plays into that kind of whole element of like, not, it's not even supernatural, the kind of lack of recognition. It just kind of shows how like strange their society is, that they have these weird familial bonds that actually they don't really know each other, and they're not really that well connected.
Yes. And what I found strange as well is, compared to Mysteries of Udolpho, I kind of felt like there was a lot less characters, which made it even weirder that people didn't recognize each other, because we were really just being, it was literally just like not even that many people that were being talked about. And it was rarely that all of the characters were in the same storyline at the same point. You know, most people, even by the end, people have like already died or disappeared before the end. So there was never a point where all characters were, I'd say maybe the end vault scene, but other than that, there was very rarely a moment where all characters were together at the same time. And so it's even weirder that people don't recognize each other or know what's going on, because they're so intertwined all the time, which was really strange. And I'm just trying to think what happens now. Do we jump back to Lothario at this point, to his storyline? Lorenzo. Oh my God, why do I keep calling him Lothario? Is that something from Mysteries of Udolpho? That's weird. Do we jump back to Lorenzo now?
Yeah, so I think we have Lorenzo, and he basically, when Agnes finds the letter in the church and then gets dragged away by the nuns, he realises what has happened to his sister, and he bumps into his friend, Raymond, who is some sort of duke or something in the town, and his friend's like, "I need to tell you something, but you can't kill me." And basically reveals that the person Agnes has slept with is him, and that he found her while he was abroad in Germany or something, and her aunt again trying to get the same guy, even though they're not interested. And basically, like, Raymond tells his whole story, which took forever, and half of it wasn't even relevant.
His memoir.
Yeah, literally the longest story ever. And basically Lorenzo comes around and is like, "Oh, okay, you genuinely want to be with my sister. That's fine. I'll write to the Pope and get a letter that means she can leave the nunnery." But by this point, the nuns have already found out that she's pregnant and he can't access her.
Yes. Yeah, this is really interesting. And Raymond's story about how he met Agnes becomes like its own separate, kind of its own separate book in a sense. It's basically like a whole different story. It's even got like a title heading, and it's like its own separate story in general. And this is really interesting as well, because this holds a lot of supernatural elements. So he meets her when he's traveling in Europe, but before he meets Agnes, he's traveling and his carriage like breaks down or something. So he ends up in this house with a man and his wife, and the wife is really mean, and he doesn't really understand why. Her name's Margarita, I think, and she's really cruel, and he doesn't really get why she's being so horrible to him. And her husband's being really nice, but then it turns out that her husband, he lures strangers to their property so he can kill them and steal their fortunes. And Margarita's not very nice to people because she's basically being held hostage as his wife, and she basically warns Raymond that this guy's trying to kill him. And they basically plot together, don't they, where they like don't drink the poison, but they also overpower the robbers and her husband and everything to stop them from stealing the money, and they escape together. And this is also when, is this when Theodora or what's his name? I can't remember his name. It's like her son.
Yeah,
and he becomes Theodore, and he becomes under the protection of Raymond. He's not that significant of a character, but he's there as well. So he becomes under Raymond's protection. They carry on through, and then they end up at Agnes's house, right? And this is when, well, it's a castle actually.
Yeah, so I think that when he's at the kind of the villain's house, when his carriage is broken, there's also a woman there, and doesn't that turn out to be Agnes's aunt?
Oh, is Margarita Agnes's aunt?
Not her. You know the other lady that they drug?
Yes, they drug another lady. Yes, they do. Yeah, there's another lady there who gets drugged. Yeah, they rescue her. That's Agnes's aunt. Yeah, absolutely.
So
and they travel together.
Yeah, so to show the thanks to Raymond for saving her, so they then get invited to visit them in Germany when they go back home. Because I think they were in Austria at this point.
Yes, yeah, we're very similar to Mysteries of Udolpho as well, that there's a lot of traveling. Specifically in this section, the main storyline, there's no traveling at all, really. They stay basically within this, like, section of Madrid that's got all the churches and, like, the nunnery and everything. But yeah, in this part of the book, there's a lot of travel. This guy moves around loads. Obviously, it was like he said, he was traveling around Europe, so he does. And yes, they end up at her aunt basically like falls in love with Raymond, but she goes like crazy about it, right? Because he spends time with the aunt to try and get on her good side so that he'll be able to marry Agnes. But then the aunt thinks that because he's spending so much time with her, it's because he's in love with her. And she's married. And she's just like, you're in love with me, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, no, I'm really not. He doesn't say who he's got feelings for, but he's just like, it's not you. And she flips out and she's like, you've got to leave and all of this. And then she sees Agnes and Raymond together. And I think Agnes gives him a portrait or something. And he's like, like swept off his feet, the fact that she gave this portrait. Then the aunt like bursts through the door and she is fuming, right?
Yeah, she's absolutely fuming. And that's how Agnes, I think, ends up in the nunnery. She's like, oh, well, I've decided that now you're going to this nunnery. Like, I think her dad had always wanted that for her. And the nunnery have a whole thing around reputation as well. And they're really keen to have women from important families within their nunnery in Madrid. So, but this is kind of the catalyst for why she ends up travelling back to Madrid. And the reason that she trusted Raymond is because he said that he said to her that he knows her brother, and she was like, oh my god, Lorenzo, you know him, but he's used like a fake name while he's traveling abroad. So when Lorenzo's then written to, he's like, I don't know who you're talking about. And it turns out that actually he's just using a fake name because he doesn't want to get harassed while he's abroad. So then they start to doubt him, and Agnes is like, oh, you're not who you say you are. So she kind of like loses her faith in him until she gets back to Madrid, and then he starts writing to her and they kind of rekindle their relationship.
Yeah. But before that happens as well, they actually make a plan of how they can run away together. And this has like supernatural elements to it as well. So Agnes tells Raymond about this story that the fifth year, every 5 years on the 5th day of the 5th month, the bloody nun turns up. Is that what her name is? I think it is, the bloody nun. She shows up and she kills the Baron who's currently living in that property. And so this is just like a spooky story that she tells Raymond. But then she's like, I'll dress up as the bloody nun. And like we can escape because I'll like scare everybody. And so, yeah, that like becomes like their plan. But the plan doesn't really work out because for whatever reason, when they're traveling in the carriage crashes. And oh my god, Raymond's injuries. This was the funniest thing. I was sat in a library reading and I was wetting myself with his injuries because I know it's not very nice like that he's injured, but it was just funny like how dramatic it was. But do you want to add anything about the bloody nun situation? Because then it turns out when he's like trying to recover from his injuries, he actually gets haunted by this actual ghost.
Yeah, so Agnes never actually escapes the castle, does she? The person that he saves from the castle is the nun. Like, the ghost of the nun comes with him, and then the carriage crashes, and then she haunts him. And then they speak to someone, and he's like, oh, it's your ancestor. You need to take her
bones and bury them.
Yeah, you need to get her bones and bury them in your family vault in Madrid so she can finally be at peace.
Yes, which was also, that was all super strange. But that guy was just a stranger. He was called the Stranger. And I'm like, that's so funny. The stranger who's got all the answers on how to get rid of the ghost. I'm just like, this is so funny. But the scene where he hurts himself, it said, I had broken 2 of my ribs in the fall, my arm being dislocated, hung useless by my side, and my left leg was shattered so terribly that I never expected to recover its use. I was like, honestly, I was wetting myself because I was like, broken ribs, your arm is dislocated, and you've shattered your leg. I'm literally just like, what?
And I swear it doesn't take that long to recover. After it doesn't sound like that. Sounds like 3 months of recovery, and I feel like it's like a week before he's back in Madrid with the bones of his ancestor.
I feel like he makes the point because he's like, I don't want to be haunted anymore by the ghosts. I mean, he says that he speeds up his recovery because of that, because like that's a thing, you can just recover quickly if you've got motive to. But anyway, yeah, it was very strange. But he buries them and the ghost disappears. Like he's not haunted by the ghost anymore.
He's a
But
very
again,
dramatic
just
character, though, isn't he, Raymond? Like, when he finds out that they can't get to Agnes and there's rumours that she's dead, he, like, nearly dies. He, like, faints away. And normally you'd think it would be the female characters that faint, but the men do a lot of fainting in this book.
yeah, and everything's kind of shown more from the male perspective as well. Like even though it's even though the narrative's third person, it's always from like it's like their story, and like these women are just like secondary characters who come into it, but it's either Ambrosio's story, Lorenzo's story, or Raymond's story, and they're like going through life and these like weird things happen to them. But what I found really strange about Raymond's story is I get that it was relevant for us to find out about Agnes, but it kind of felt like it was just thrown in there, the supernatural. It was like, oh, I've not added anything that's supernatural for a while, I better throw that in because I'm saying it's a gothic novel. Because I was like, why was that relevant?
Yeah, the bit with the nun wasn't really relevant at all, like the nun that was haunting him. But I guess it kind of added more depth to kind of like the gothic elements of the book, because otherwise they're quite kind of more based again, it's all still based around religion. Like it is a nun,
Yeah.
and I think it's a nun that was mistreated, and that is where she kind of starts to haunt that building. So it's interesting that actually you get this element of kind of like mistreatment of women, but also kind of sin and going against the rules of the church, like throughout the book.
Yeah, that's interesting actually that you say that, because her story is kind of interesting. Like the nun's story is that she kills the Baron because she wants to marry his brother. And then when she goes to his brother, like, I've killed him, it's all good, we can be together, the brother kills her because he's like, oh, all I wanted to be Baron, I wanted the fortune. And so then he kills her, and that's why she's left like disturbed. Like that's why she haunts the property, because her bones are just laying there in this like underground tunnel where they were going to like run away together. So it is kind of, it's slightly disturbing, but yeah. And the point was as well, I think she was like being forced to go to a nunnery or something, I can't remember, but there was like some aspect of it where it kind of mirrors Agnes's story to an extent. So yeah, it was all pretty mad though. And then after that, they plan together to go and save Agnes, don't they? They're like, oh, Raymond and Lorenzo like team up so that they can go and save her, which then brings them back to Madrid.
Raymond has a way of getting into the garden, which is where he saw Agnes and they slept together to make her fall pregnant. So he has a way into the garden, but when like they can't track her down when they're there. So what ends up happening is Theodore kind of comes into his own a little bit, and we have a bit more of him as he finds multiple ways to try and get into the nunnery to find Agnes. And one of them is he pretends to be like a beggar and says to them, oh, I don't have a bowl, because people come to the nunnery for like alms and bring their own bowls to have soup and things, but they think he's really adorable, so they like let him in, and then like they let him like sing this song, which I definitely skipped because I was like, stop putting the longest poems ever in this book. And he's singing in the hopes that Agnes will hear him and recognize his voice and then like cry out to him, but it doesn't happen. So then they're even more convinced that actually she's been killed. So
why
then,
would that happen? Isn't that weird though? Why would she be like, oh, got to be Theodore? Does she even know him that well?
I think that they've met before because I think he helped get Raymond in, but it was just crazy. And then they kind of tell the public that this has happened, and then the public start like rioting because the nuns have killed Agnes.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So this is really weird. So the head nun actually goes and says that she's dead. And everybody, like, this causes like an uproar because everyone's like, why is she dead? This is crazy. And obviously, and Raymond freaks out. He's devastated, like, goes into mad depression. Lorenzo, he's pretty devastated as well that his like sisters died. Which then leads him to like just be more focused on getting Antonio as a wife, but she's got a whole stuff going on in her own right. So yeah, this like causes pretty mad chaos. And I feel like it's at this point, don't we flip back to Ambrosia and Matilda and how they start to plan. So Matilda's really upset that Antonio's gone off her. Ambrosio, sorry. Matilda's really upset that Ambrosio's gone off her and doesn't want to sleep with her anymore. And he's been really cruel to her, actually. He's like, you know, you're nothing to me. But Matilda's got like eyes everywhere, or is like looking in a crystal ball. Oh, I think it's a mirror, isn't it? Hasn't she got like a mirror where she can see the person that she wants to? It like gets all real Snow Whitey, and she's like, show me my desire or something. It shows her Ambrosio, and it shows him longing for Antonia. And so she comes to him and she's like, I know who you want now, and I want to help you get it. So like her whole thing in life now becomes about making sure Ambrosio has his way with Antonia. By whatever means, like as long as he gets to fulfill his desires, she's happy, because that's why she thinks that's her purpose in life. And Matilda, obviously, because she's, you know, a skilled witch, she has all these different methods, and she gives him a magic myrtle branch, right?
Yes. So she does that, but before then, he already goes to Antonia's house to kind of like dote on her mum and like help pray for her mum. And the mum, oh Rex, sorry. And her mum, Elvira, is like really unsure about the monk. Like there's something she recognizes within him, but she's never met him before, and she's really confused about why he seems so familiar. But she also doesn't trust him, so they watch him like a hawk whenever he's there. So he's like, oh, how can I seduce this innocent woman and ruin her when they watch me? So then he calls on Matilda, and that's when she gives him like the magic branch. But she tells him that this has come from Lucifer, like the devil has given this to her, and he will only allow her to ask for this one thing for Ambrosia, and in the future he'll have to ask for things himself from the devil if he wants his help.
Yes, and he's like partially like really freaked out. He's like, oh my goodness, what? But then is also like, well, give me the branch because I want to go and have my way with Antonia, so I don't care. And what's really interesting is traditionally a myrtle branch was actually a sign of like commitment and marriage. It was like something that was like part of like a wedding ceremony. It meant like unionship, whereas obviously like many things in this book, it's completely turned on its head in this, because he wants to use the branch to sleep with Antonia out of wedlock. So out of wedlock? Yeah. He wants to sleep with Antonia before they're married. They can't even get married because he's a monk. So yeah, and the branch opens any door that you want, and if you put it on the pillow of like the person of your desire, they fall into like a deep sleep. So this is when the book starts to get super creepy, I think, because it becomes clear that from this point forward, Ambrosio is not interested in consensual sex anymore, what he had with Matilda. Like he crosses a line now, and it starts to get into the realms of sexual assault. He already tries once, I believe, with Antonio. She gets really upset because he starts like groping her and kissing her and everything, and she's crying, and her mum walks in and she's like, what are you doing? Like, get off my daughter, like please leave and never come back. Which is why he then starts to go to these like drastic measures. But what he also realizes Antonio's not interested in him, so he thinks going forward she needs to be unconscious, which is extremely disturbing, let's be very clear. And that's why this book just gets super dark from this point on.
Yeah, so he turns up and he lays the pillow, and there's this whole bit where he basically is talking out loud about how beautiful she is and how he can't wait to like ruin her. And it was very uncomfortable. And her mum then rushes in, who is like not been very well, because she gets something come to her in a dream where she's like, something's going to happen to my daughter, like I need to save her. So they get into this like massive fight, and obviously Antonia's not waking up because this branch is on her pillow, and he ends up suffocating the mum and like letting her die, and then just runs away.
Yeah, what's so weird about this as well is his motive isn't because he like still wants to go for Antonio. He's literally again worried about his reputation. He's like, I can't let you live because if I do, you're going to tell the whole of Madrid about me. It was just bizarre, and like this is what I mean. Like when he starts to like lose control and things start to spiral, his actions become worse and worse. Like the extremes just jump. Now he wants to just unalive people left, right, and center, and yeah, it's tragic. And obviously her mum dies, which is awful for her. She's absolutely devastated. Antonia goes into like mourning over her mum, and it also throws her like situation in life out like into a bit of a spiral, because Lorenzo's not turned back up saying that he's going to marry her because he's still not got permission. But doesn't he have a moment where he comes to the window and it's like, what's that film where the guy turns up with a boombox? It's like kind of like that. He's like, doesn't he like stand outside? He's got like a band and they're like playing to him, but like she doesn't recognize it's for her. She thinks it's for someone else.
Yeah, I think it's
Stood
like
outside
every
your
night.
window.
Yeah, it's like every night I think he like brings this music, but he's kind of disappeared because he's so focused on finding Agnes and like getting her out and helping Raymond. So Antonia's like not at the top of his thoughts. But he also was given a charge because Raymond, I think, is related to Antonia. I think that's her mum's brother-in-law. So
Yes.
she's been kind of like campaigning to him to like help, but where he's like bedridden because he thinks Agnes is dead, he doesn't get to her to help her in time. So she has all this drama. Her mum's dead. She's got no one looking after her. They're kind of lodging with a lady who's very dramatic.
Oh, I love her. The woman who's
Yeah.
like running around and she's like, somebody help me. There's ghosts. They come to me. There's like this and that going on. She's a really funny character, the
Yeah.
landlord.
Well, Antonia then kind of is like in her mother's room, isn't she, and sees her mother's ghost. And it's like, oh, you have 3 days and you're going to be joining me or something. So
Just how you want your mum to haunt you. Jeez. I'd be like, oh, that's so dramatic. You just traumatized.
yeah. And then the landlady's like running around, and she then goes to invite the monk, Ambrosio, back to the house to get rid of this spirit.
The new ghost. Yeah.
So he then comes, but Flora, who's like their maid, has been warned by Antonia's mum before she passed away that he's not trustworthy. So she like watches him the whole time. And then at one point he stays overnight in the house in the bedroom of her mum, like to like keep an eye out for the ghost, and notices that like the wardrobe door's open, and he doesn't think it was open when he first went in there. And then he like gets paranoid that someone's there, and he pulls the curtain back, and there is Flora just watching him. Like she's broken into the room to watch him and like check he's not doing anything to Antonio, and it was just absolutely hilarious.
It was so weird because I thought it was going to be her mum's ghost again appearing, like to haunt him, to be like, you killed me. And I'm pretty sure, doesn't she haunt him at one point? Like, is it later that evening that she like appears to him or something? And he's like really upset because Antonio is really ill from this. And what's really even more disturbing about Ambrosio is, yes, he has these awful intentions with Antonia, but he tries to justify it by trying to make out that he's like in love with her and he has such strong feelings for her, and he has to like settle his own desires for her because he's that in love with it. Like, it's super important that he does this. It's so disturbing because she's not at all interested in him in this way. And I just hate the way that he tries to justify his actions because he's like, I'm in love, and it's like, no, you're just a horrible person.
Yeah, he spends a lot of time justifying himself, and then following this, when she's really unwell, him and Matilda then hatch a plan about how he can get her away from Flora and these people so that he can then have what he wants. And what they decide to do is they decide to drug her so it will seem like she's died, like very kind of like Romeo and Juliet-esque. So like it will like slow her pulse down, she'll seem dead, they can put her in the vault, and then when she wakes up he's like, hey, you're not actually dead and I'm here.
Yeah, the guy's so weird. He has this thing about like trying to be like coming across as the hero because he thinks Antonio is going to be interested in him if he's like the rescuer, but he always like just does something incredibly disturbing or creepy at the same time. Like, he can't just be a decent person at this point. Like, he's always just like overthrown by his like terrible desires and wants and all of this lot. And yeah, it's pretty terrible. But yeah, him and Matilda, yeah, come up with this plan to drug her, which he does give her this drug and she dies ish, but she's not really dead. She's like basically in a coma. And at this point she's taken to the crypt, right? She's put inside,
So
like with all the other dead bodies.
a lot of volume 3 takes place underground. because the mob in Madrid have started kind of like attacking the nuns because of the story of Agnes and them thinking that Agnes has been murdered by this nun, and they're really disgusted that a nun would do that. So they then start attacking. So a lot of the nuns that were innocent kind of go into the vaults underneath the monastery and the nunnery, and Lorenzo's down there too, trying to like help them and support them. And then they find this woman, and at this point we don't know who she is. They find this woman hidden in one of the vaults and rescue her, but he doesn't know who she is either. And she's like quite emaciated, and I think she's been down there for quite a few days. And it's quite clear that it's not Antonia. So we're like, who is this other woman buried underground? So he rescues her, and then we kind of have a pause on that plotline to go back to Ambrosio and his obsession with Antonia.
Women? Don't they rescue 2 women in the vault? Like 2 random women that we don't know who they are. I swear there's 2. There's one who obviously will explain who that person is, and then there's another one who marries.
Yeah, that's one of the nuns. Well, she's not a nun.
Oh,
she's
that's one of the nuns.
She's a novia, so she's not taken her orders yet. So yeah, they rescue a woman called Virginia, and the other nuns that are down there, they basically keep them safe because the people in the mob have just started murdering nuns because they're so disgusted with them. So yeah, they rescue Virginia, who is like a novia at the nunnery. She hasn't taken her orders yet, but she's kind of like a novice in training. And then they find this other woman as well, like underground.
Yeah.
And neither of these are Antonia.
So this part of the book's really interesting though, because this is one of the only times that all these characters start to come together, and it is really weird because they are all underground in these like vaults where there's all these dead bodies and like, you know, bones and stuff. It is kind of creepy, I suppose, that they're all like running around here. And at the same time, Ambrosio turns up into the crypt that Antonio's been laid in, and she's lying there obviously lifeless, even though she is alive. She's like in a coma. And at this point, he's like, would like to assault her. And yeah, this bit was just like so disturbing. And she kind of wakes up because she's like, wait, where am I? Like, what's going on? And she's totally freaked out, understandably, because she's like underground. There's all these like dead bodies around her. And she's like, oh my gosh. And he thinks when she sees him, that she'll be like, oh, you're here, my savior, you've come to rescue me. But she's actually like, oh my gosh, what is happening and why are you here? Like, get away from me.
Yeah, and there's a lot. The creepiest part was not the dead bodies, it is his thought processes in this part of the book. He spends so much time contemplating the fact that he's going to have non-consensual sex with her, whether she like without her interest, and he's like staring at her for ages, but there's so much focus on it, and actually that bit was way more uncomfortable for me than any supernatural element. It was so horrible to read him trying to like justify this to himself for ages, like pages and pages of him talking about what he's going to do, and then him trying to explain himself to her and her trying to fight him off, and him just literally being like, this is what I'm going to do whether you like it or not. But he's still trying to justify that he's not doing anything wrong the whole way through.
I know. Yeah, it's so right. It's so true, because all the like the supernatural stuff and like the gothic elements, they're all very the gothic motifs, like they're things that you expect in gothic novels, you know, like ghosts, and there's like castles and crypts and all, you know, all of this kind of thing going on. But yeah, his behavior, it goes beyond the gothic. It's just like dark and disturbing and really creepy. And yeah, that scene was just the worst. It was disgusting. It was just awful.
Yeah, it was horrible.
Yeah,
to
just
read.
awful.
And I think as well, I feel like kind of what it's showing is that actually you can have these ghosts and all these gothic elements, but actually human nature is the worst thing out of all of them. Like the things that he does to other women, generally, he doesn't really harm any men in this book. He only really harms women. He suffocates someone, he sexually assaults someone. That is worse than any of the supernatural things that happen within this book, and they're all kind of perpetuated by someone who is viewed to be saintly and like godlike.
Yes. Yeah. And I feel like what's really weird in the book is there's this like this they make it really clear that this guy's like the fact that he is not going to have sex because he's like a monk and all of this lot, and that's really important to him, that he stays like pure and that's not something that he does in everything. And yet there's other male characters who, even though they desire women, they actually want to have like an actual commitment with them, where they're like, I want to marry this person first, like that's really important to them. And him, in comparison, even though he's meant to be like the most, I don't know, like divine one, like the one that's actually, you know, works for God, or I don't know, whatever he's got going on, he's the one that's like the worst person. Like he is just awful, and he is literally just driven by sexual desire. And it's so weird as well, because in the book he's described as being timid like a woman, and it's like, isn't that so strange? Because all of his actions, he's almost like, just, I don't know, it kind of is, he's almost like an animal in a sense. Like he just doesn't have any like thought process around it. Like he's just like, this is what I want, I'm gonna go and get it. I don't care. And
Yeah,
even though he has
like
these monologues, it's not normal. Like it's not compassionate. He has no empathy.
no, and there'll be like one sentence where he's like, "Oh, maybe I should feel bad about this, but I don't," and then he'll kind of justify it to himself for ages and ages and ages. And again, it comes back to his reputation, because his biggest concern after he has non-consensual sex with Antonia, she's like, okay, you've ruined me, you've taken my virginity, you've like left me with no prospects and no opportunities for a happy future, but please can I now just go back to Flora and my family so that like I can continue my life? And he's like, no, because you'll tell people and my reputation's the most important thing again. And then Matilda turns up and she's like, what are you doing? Here's a dagger, I think you need to kill her.
I know. Yeah, this bit's mad as well. It's so awful, because Antonia as a character, she is like really lovely. She's like, which I know comes up in Gothic literature all the time. Like there's this like woman who's like, you know, really innocent and pure, and yeah, and she's that's who she is. She's just kind and innocent. She knows nothing of the world. And he is awful to her, and that all she wants to do is leave. And then Matilda's like, yeah, let's kill her. And she actually escapes though, and she's like running down the vault. This part actually got me like so nervous. I was like, go Antonio, go please.
So,
and he kills her, he stabs her.
yeah, so Matilda and Ambrosio start having an argument, and they can hear people moving through the vaults, and this is Lorenzo and the others who have been protecting the nuns. So now the timelines are like happening at the same time. We've kind of seen what Lorenzo's doing with the nuns, trying to keep them safe, finding the woman underground that isn't Antonia, and then this kind of bit is happening at the same time, all within the same space. So when they start arguing, she's like, I'm going to run for it. And she's like sprinting as fast as she can. And she's screaming out, saying, help, help, somebody help me. And they start coming. So he's like, oh, I'm just going to stab you. But there's nowhere for him to go. He can't get away. But so there's no reasoning behind what he does. He's just in this frenzy now. And it says that he like stabs her twice, and she lives long enough for Lorenzo to come, and he's absolutely devastated because he's been wanting to marry her. And she then is like, I can die happy now knowing that you wanted me, even though like I would now ruin, so you couldn't have had me anyway, but at least I'll be with my mum. And it's as predicted 3 days on from when she had the kind of ghost visit, that this is what's now happened and she's now died. And they then kind of storm the vault where Ambrosio is, and him and Matilda both get arrested, and he's covered in blood and the dagger's there, so that there's kind of no going back, like they know what he's done.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lorenzo gets out of the vault with everybody, and it turns out that the woman that he rescued turned out to be Agnes. She was still alive. It is his sister. He just didn't recognize her because she was looking really rough, because she'd been like kept in a vault and not fed, and her hair was crazy. And also she'd given birth to her child who died because she didn't have any, like, isn't that right? And like the child didn't have any food or anything, so the child died.
Yeah, she says that she didn't know what she was meant to do with it. Like, she didn't know how to look after this baby. She was really emaciated. She hadn't eaten or had fluids, because there was a nun called Camilla who was like delivering her food and water like daily, but I think she falls ill. So they're like, oh, well, Camilla's not doing it, so we're just going to leave her now.
We'll just forget, yeah. And a lot of this is stemmed by the head nun, who's meant to be really cruel. And everybody knows this in Madrid. They all know that she's really cruel, and her like punishments are like over the top. And she tries to justify them. She's very similar to Ambrosio in that sense. She tries to justify her reasoning behind why she does certain things. in her reasoning makes no sense. She's just not very nice. And I don't think we need to get into too much of what, because Agnes then tells her whole story, which is a little bit unnecessary because it's quite clear what's happened. Like, we kind of already know. But then there's also another twist. Do you want to talk about the last twist that comes? Well, there's a couple of twists. Do you want to talk about the twists that come at the end of the book?
Yeah, because when you messaged me this morning to be like, oh, I'm on the last chapter, I was like, just wait, because it is wild. Like, so much has happened in this volume, and it was a really uncomfortable volume to read. Agnes's story was a little bit of kind of light relief, I guess, even though what happened to her was still horrendous. It wasn't quite on the same scale of what happened to Antonia, and we kind of get a little bit of redemption for her, and it kind of shows that actually, yes, she might have like had sex out of wedlock and had this baby. Actually, she is a good person. She has good morals, and she ends up getting what she wants, and her and Raymond end up together, and they kind of have a happy ending.
Yeah.
But it then comes to the point where we've got Ambrosio and Matilda who have been arrested, and they basically get kind of interrogated, and it explains something. It says something like, they get told to confess. If they don't confess, they get tortured. Then they get left. Then their crimes get brought before them again. And the crimes that come before him are like killing someone, witchcraft, and kind of sorcery. And he's adamant that actually he's not done any of that. Only Matilda did. He just benefited from it. But it reaches the point where Matilda kind of comes to him in his vault, like in the jail. And
yeah, she's like free.
She's free because she's signed her soul away to the devil, to Lucifer, and he's helped her escape. And then she's like, this is what you need to do to get out of here. And he's like, oh, okay. Because she's been told that she's going to be burned. Like, her kind of outcome for the crime she's committed is she's going to be burned. So she uses Lucifer to escape. And he... it's like, oh, I don't know if I should do that. And it's like, you've done everything else now. You might as well. What else have you got to lose? So he then kind of calls upon Lucifer, and Lucifer turns up, and he's like, you need to sign your soul away to me. And he's like, can't I give you something else? And Lucifer's like, no, don't waste my time. Don't call me here.
Typical Ambrosio. The guy's such a coward.
He's like, yeah, don't call me here if that's what you're going to give me. Like, don't waste my time. Like, I'm the devil. Like, this is what you need to do.
I'm the devil. It's me.
Yeah, to get out of this cell. And he's very clear that is what his promise is, to get out of the cell. He's not offering him redemption. He's not offering him like kind of a way out. He's offering him a physical way to get out of that physical space. So he then like gives him this pen, and he has to sign his soul away with his like own blood. And then
the devil just carrying around pens and contracts killed me. I was just like, yeah.
And then when the devil then like removes him from the cell, he's like, oh, and now you're going to go burn in hell. And Ambrosio's like, wait, what? I thought that you were saving me. And he's like, from that space, I never promised you anything else. And it turns out that the whole time, Matilda was put there by the devil to tempt him. Like, she's not really a real person. She is something that he has put there because he knows that Ambrosio is not a good guy. So all the crazy stuff Matilda does actually is all around his ruin. Like, she never had his best interests at heart. She was planted there by the devil.
Yes. That was so weird. And what's so funny is Ambrosio's like, oh, can I go and be with Matilda now? And the devil's like, Matilda doesn't exist, okay? I planted her. Okay, no, you're just going to suffer now. Let's be clear.
And when the devil like kind of counts his crimes out to Ambrosio, it says all the things he's done, it turns out that matricide is one of his crimes, because Elvira turns out to be his mum who left him at the monastery gate. So when he slept with Antonia, that was his sister. So he's like, you've also committed incest. And he's like, wait, what? And then it kind of made sense why earlier on Elvira's like, this guy seems really familiar and I can't place it. So it was quite a subtle hint, and they didn't really cover it too much early on. But I remembered that bit when I read the final scene to be like, oh, they foreshadowed this element as well. So it's very cleverly crafted, the book.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what's really interesting as well is, like you said before, that Agnes and Raymond actually do end up together. So in the book, like, he states that sex is really just natural. Actually, vows of like chastity is what was unnatural. That's what Lewis is kind of putting out there in this book, that he's literally just like, sex is the natural thing. What's unnatural is trying to abstain from sex. So I thought that was interesting. I was like, you do you, Lewis, why not? So yeah, that was really interesting. And the point was saying that, which I didn't believe, I just think the Ambrosio was just a horrible person. But it's kind of saying as well, because he was isolated and kept away from everything and then put on this pedestal of perfection, he had so much further to fall, and he fell so much further than most people.
Yeah, and that is such a good point. And actually, like we said earlier, Agnes says to him, you will fall from this pedestal because you have judged me, and you have no right to judge me, like you are not God. And I think that he thinks he is some kind of God. So it's really interesting the way that kind of plays out. And I think it's quite clear that it's kind of taking a negative view of Catholicism and the way that religion functions, because of the way it turns out in the end. And actually the most religious man, I guess, that they have in the book, from who you think is going to be the most religious from the outset, is the one who ends up signing his soul away to the devil at the end, all for his own gain and selfish reasons.
Yes. Yeah, the book is full of just like so many twists and turns. It's really quite crazy. What's interesting though is, if, Matthew Lewis is coming from the stance that this is because I'm against the Catholic faith, because I'm Protestant and everything, there isn't an alternative Christian faith that he's like drawn to either. It's not like he's saying, oh, because I'm Protestant. It's like he's just drawn to atheism. Like maybe he's just like not religious at all. That was the kind of vibe that I got, because it wasn't like he was saying, oh, it's because actually it's this other branch of Christianity that I'm drawn to. It just, for me, it was the sense that he was just against any type of faith or spirituality or anything like that.
No, I completely get that. It kind of seems like he's saying, when you put faith above everything without actually having proper human morals and acting the way that you should for humanity, that's not acceptable. So he's saying that the people that are the most human in the book and make mistakes but kind of repent them and move on from them, like Raymond and Agnes and Lorenzo, they all get their happy ending because they're not using religion as an excuse for their behaviour. Whereas the nun, who ends up being killed unalived by the kind of mob in Madrid, and Ambrosio, they both suffer because they've tried to kind of enforce this like strict code of morality that isn't actually based on how real life works.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so strange, like how it all comes about. And it's interesting that all of the guidance that comes from people is in a supernatural form. Like there's no emphasis that, obviously, like the devil's showing up every the Christian version of the devil is showing up every like 5 seconds, but there's no emphasis that God ever shows up. It's literally like, you know what I mean, there's those two contrasts aren't there. Who shows up with these like supernatural elements, and it's like ghosts and things. It's like spirits of your own ancestors show up to like guide the way, which I thought was really interesting as well. That it isn't like, there wasn't like this set opposition to the devil. It was just like human nature and devil.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. It kind of showed when we focus too much on kind of, well, I guess with the characters that were really religious, they were like, well, in Catholicism, there's a big thing, isn't there, around repenting, confessing, and then being forgiven, and then being able to carry on. And kind of what this book is showing is you can't just act however you want and then try and repent and be able to move on from that. The characters that kind of act in a good way throughout, they can move on from the challenges in their lives. But the ones who act in a way of evil and do things that are completely unacceptable but try and justify it to themselves, they're the ones that end up being punished in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really interesting as well, so how this appears in Northanger Abbey is initially John Thorpe mentions it as a book that he's read, and also Isabella Thorpe says, once you finish Udolpho, we'll read The Monk, and they talk about how awful that the book, like, oh, is it really that terrible and everything. And I think it's so interesting that the two characters out of Northanger Abbey who are promoting this book is Isabella and John Thorpe. So, like, that's so fitting.
Yeah, it is really fitting, because John Thorpe doesn't ask what Catherine wants or ask for her consent to go on a carriage ride. She just forces him into whatever he thinks is the right thing to do. And it's really interesting that he is kind of promoting that book, and also Isabella, who we know is a false character. She's not who she says she is, and she doesn't act in a way that is true and honest. She is sneaky, and she's also very focused on her reputation and who she can benefit from.
Yes. And she also, you know what I thought was weird though? I was like, so interesting that she's read that book, and she is most like Matilda, I would say, in this book. But then I'm also like, why didn't she see that for what it was? Like, why didn't she see it and be like, oh gosh, like it doesn't work out for Matilda. She's not even like real. She's just like an accomplice of the devil. Like, why? Well, I want to do that, but genuinely, like, obviously they're characters and they don't learn like that. But the point is, like, I just think it's so interesting that it's those two that promote this book, because that makes so much sense, right? That makes so much sense. I think the other books that Henry talks to Catherine about, the Radcliffe books, are not this dark. Like Mysteries of Udolpho was not this dark at all. Yes, there was some crazy things that happened. Some people were unalived at some points, but it was not in this kind of detail. It was like some people would get into sword fights and accidentally die. Whereas this was like, this guy was actively out to unalive people, actively out to harm them, and obviously assault them. It's just like really dark.
Yeah, it was quite a different book to Udolpho, because actually in Udolpho it's gothic, but actually nothing, from what I remember, I don't think anything actually turned out to be supernatural. It was all what humans have done, and the main character thinks it's supernatural, but actually it's not. It's all got an explanation. So like these voices that they hear, that is a person. It's not a ghost. So it was really interesting that one kind of has all these elements, but actually it's people the whole way through, and it's showing kind of like the wrong things that people do. And this is showing that as well, but actually with a big element of supernatural that does happen. Like we have witchcraft, we have the devil, we have ghosts, and we have kind of those sorts of elements throughout the book. But I can't even imagine being like Catherine Morland's age and reading this. Like, I was finding it really difficult to read the last volume, and we're living in the 21st century. We're living in like a modern society where we know what sex and those relationships are. It was quite graphic, and I can totally see why it was such a scandalous book at the time. And as much as I obviously don't agree with the patriarchy kind of determining what young women should read, I can see why they didn't want young women reading this book, because it is very, very difficult and full of some really awful themes and scenes.
Yeah, it genuinely. I mean, did you find out whether or not this book was actually banned at some point? Because I'm even shocked it could even be in like, that it could even be in publication, because it's really quite graphic and extreme.
I didn't find out, actually.
I don't know either. I'm trying to find out here, because I feel like that would just be like right up there, but it's not. It doesn't say.
But the author was only 19 when he wrote this.
Oh my gosh.
So it kind of like rivals kind of like Mary Shelley type thing, where they wrote it when they were really young. And I think I think his age kind of shows through in the sense that you can tell that he's kind of exploring ideas about what life is, which is quite common at that age. And that's very similar to kind of what Mary Shelley does in Frankenstein. She kind of is exploring the themes of like creation and like good versus evil. And it's kind of like they're coming to that age of life where they're meant to be adults now, but they're still figuring things out. So I think that's a really interesting point, that they're quite young. Like the author of this book is quite young.
Yes. Do you know what I find really weird though? The title of the book is The Monk, a Romance. And I don't understand that at all.
No. It's a bit like I've not read this yet, but I probably will at some point, because I found Mysteries of Udolpho so entertaining. But like the Anne Radcliffe novel, like The Romance of the Forest, which is mentioned in Emma, I think it's a book that Harriet's enjoyed, and she mentions it to Mr. Martin, and she's really disappointed when they bump into him and he hasn't read it yet. And Emma's like, what? He doesn't have time to read The Romance of the Forest? What is he doing? And it's like, I'm sure that book is not actually romantic based on our modern concepts. So I think the romance is romance with a capital R, which is like kind of like the romantic era. Rather than...
But isn't it a bit too early for that? Like, that's what I was thinking. I'm like, this is so weird. What is he, like a pioneering romantic? I don't understand. Like, unless it's like it's like looking at things from Ambrosio's point of view, that he thinks, like, do you know what I mean? Where he tries to justify, he's like, I'm in love with these people, so it's fine. Like, maybe it's like a commentary on romance, where it's literally just like, it's turned on its head like so many other things are in this book.
Yeah, or it could be kind of like the more traditional like view of like romance, like with some of the books that were written in like the medieval times, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. That's cast as a romance, but actually it's a knight tackling a massive giant, and it's not a very romantic book.
Okay, that's interesting. Maybe someone who's listening will know like why certain books are called romances when they're clearly not romances.
It's very
You'll have to
different.
let us know.
I'm quite a big romance reader by modern standards. It's a very different romance to the sorts of books I enjoy reading, and it does not fall under a modern romance category. Yes, there is relationships in this book, but most of them are very dark.
Yes, absolutely. The last volume was disturbing, but the rest of the book and some of the aspects of the book and some of the supernatural elements I did find super interesting though. I actually found it quite an enjoyable read apart from I'd say the last few pages were probably the hardest, but the rest of the book I actually found really enjoyable. And I thought a lot of it was interesting. I think Ambrosio was really messed up, and I feel like, but what I did enjoy is Matilda's aspect. Even though Matilda was awful, I thought like what she brought to the book was really interesting.
Yeah, she was such an interesting character, and I feel like I found this when I've read like kind of Austen's contemporaries and people that kind of come before that. Obviously, I know I love Austen. I've read all her books countless times. But with Udolpho, I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to enjoy this, and then I did. And the same with this. I was like, oh, I wonder how it will be. And it's a very readable book, apart from the poems, which I did skip, and the songs, because I was like, I'm not going to understand this, and I'm not. I don't feel like it added from a lot of the reviews. It doesn't really add a lot. He's just kind of like sometimes the characters make a critique of the poem, but I think it was the first two volumes were really captivating, and I guess the third one I really didn't enjoy. But at the same time, that is because it made me really uncomfortable, which is clearly his aim. So it's a very well written book in the sense that volume 3 was horrible to read, and it did make me feel really uncomfortable, but that's the point. So it's doing what it sets out to do really successfully.
That is so true. Yeah, exactly. Like the author gets his aim, like what he wants us to feel when we read that is discomfort. Like I think a lot of reviews state it as horror over gothic as well, and I think that is actually more fitting. Like these things are actually terrifying. Like they're not like creepy in like a fun, watching a Tim Burton film in October. This is like, actually dark, disturbing stuff, but also has the supernatural elements on top of it. But yeah, I did really enjoy like reading the book. I thought it was a good read, and I think it's worth a read. I feel like I get so much more out of Northanger Abbey the more books I read from Catherine Morland's reading list. Like I had that with Mysteries of Udolpho, especially that one, just because there were so many links to the plot of Northanger in Udolpho. But this one, I feel like it makes me see more of Isabella and John Thorpe's character, because I'm literally just like, yes, this is the kind of thing they would read. They are just kind of left to do whatever they want, and they kind of set out to be these like corrupt people. You know what I mean? They never go out there with the best intentions, and so I can understand why this would be a book that they'd be really into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also it kind of reflects some other elements in Northanger Abbey around when they have the conversation when Catherine's like, something awful is coming out of London. And what that is a new Gothic novel. And Eleanor's, oh my God, my brain then. Eleanor's fears around rioting and those sorts of things. So kind of, it plays in really nicely to kind of that political culture at the time. And the arguments around Austen have changed a lot, but there used to be a kind of big field of thought like Austen isn't political, but it is. It's so there in all of her books. It's just not in your face. And if you're not familiar with the political landscape, you wouldn't pick up on it.
Yes, that's so true. And the whole idea around reading at the time and women reading. And I actually think it's actually so bold of Austen to even mention this book in that book, and that it be like a young woman reading it and them chatting about it together, because there was like this whole kind of scandal about the fact that the people that went to bookshops were young women. Like they were devouring books, like fictional books, at a rapid pace. And I actually think, even though like in Austen's books, like we don't see like have much sex or anything, I feel like her even leaving this in there is like an emphasis that she knows what's going on in the world. Like, she's not like blind to any of this. Yes, she doesn't state it specifically in her own books, but we always have like reference to it. Like, we see that with Lydia and Wickham, we see that with Frederick and Isabella. Like, there are hints of it, and leaving stuff like this, I feel like, is more of a signpost to it.
And Mansfield Park, which is her least romantic novel, has a lot of references to that, particularly with Maria and Henry Crawford. Like, she is then ruined and left to go and live with Aunt Norris, which I can't think of anything worse, to be honest, than living with that woman.
Yeah, I actually felt more Mansfield Park. I felt the monk's influence more on Mansfield Park than any other book. When I was reading it, I was like, I don't know why, but it's really giving Mansfield Park vibes. I don't know whether it's that like that whole underlying like sexual desire, because I feel like that's really heavy in Mansfield Park, where people, especially in the play scenes, when they're all like going off into private corners to like practice and stuff, and all the flirting, and the fact that it's all done, it's a small group of characters and it's all kind of done behind the scenes, and the fact that underpinning that is these like religious characters, like Edmund's going to go in the church and Fanny's really religious and stuff, and I feel like it's that crossover between like religion and, you know, the temptations of life, I suppose, and then people just being like really awful and corrupt, because I feel like that's blended in Mansfield Park, kind of similar to how it's blended in this with the two different storylines.
Yeah, I think Mansfield Park is one of Austen's most interesting novels. When I first read it, I was kind of expecting something more like Pride and Prejudice, which it isn't in any way. But now I've reread it more and more as an adult, I appreciate it so much more. And there's so much depth, and it's such an interesting novel. And all of her books have social commentary on them. Like Northanger Abbey has a big defence of the novel and women's reading and women's stories, and that's a really powerful theme in that. But Mansfield Park has got so much turmoil under the surface, and it's just such an interesting novel. I can see why people don't love it as much, because it's not got the humour of Pride and Prejudice or like the yearning of Persuasion, which are my two favourites. But I think it is such an interesting novel with so much depth.
Agreed. And I feel like as well that Austen says in that book, and in like a lot of her books, like even mentioning this, shows that she's saying even like women writers, we can discuss what's moral and immoral. We can discuss that conflict. And I feel like she does that in a lot in Mansfield Park and Northanger Abbey specifically. I feel like she says that like, this is a conversation we can have as well. Yes, like Matthew Lewis has this in his book, but I love that Austen's like saying, this is something I can explore as well. It's like, you know, an author. I can look into these topics as well. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean that I can't explore these topics.
Exactly, and it's so often that morality, the rules were enforced on women and not men. Like Henry Crawford gets off really lightly in Mansfield Park. I think he's a fascinating character, actually. I love any scenes with Henry. I think he's so interesting. But he gets away with so much more than any of the female characters do. And what he does isn't moral. What he's doing isn't okay. But because he's a man, he gets away with so much more than the female characters do.
Yeah, I think a lot of it as well is because he's technically single. And so him going after Maria, it's almost Maria's choice at the end of the day. Does she choose to go off with Henry because she doesn't have to? And that's why I always get caught up in the whole, like, is Henry as bad as Maria? Like, I always get kind of caught there because I'm like, well, you know, I guess at the end of the day, it was Maria's choice. Like, it's not like Henry forces her to go with him, and she was married and settled and had her family. She had an out of her marriage and stuff. So for me, that's what I mean though, Mansfield Park, it's such a moral debate. It's so difficult, and you can go back and forth on it. This, you can't go back and forth. It's just wrong what goes on in this book. But I love that for Austen, it is more nuanced. Like, it isn't just is clear black and white. That's a bad person and this is a good person, or this is just a normal person who's just living their life and doing stuff, and you make mistakes, you move on, you carry on, and you just live your life. I love that in Austen's stuff, it's like you can flip back and forth between what you think about character. Like, is this person moral, immoral? I don't know. It's difficult.
Yeah, like her characters, I always feel like with her characters, everything they do makes sense. Even if you don't know the why at the time, their characters never betray who they are. Like, her characterization is just so strong. And everything they do makes sense for that character. And it does mean that you really understand them and they are really human. And I think the most human character we get in The Monk is probably Agnes, because she's the one who has sinned, but actually she's a good person. She suffers because of other people forcing their ideas of morality on her. And actually, in the end, everything works out well for her. So there is kind of like that level of morality, that there is that explanation, like she may have been judged harshly by society, but actually in the end everything turns out okay for her, whereas society should have been judging Ambrosio, and they only did right at the end when his crimes got really, really bad.
Yes. So true. Yeah, absolutely. It's just, but yeah, crazy read. I would recommend it, as I would recommend Mysteries of Udolpho. I'm going to make cheat sheets just like I did for Mysteries of Udolpho as well, because I feel like it's handy if you don't want to read it, because they are quite dense books. So if you don't fancy reading them, then you can use the cheat sheets instead, and you can see what you can pick up. And I'll add the Northanger Abbey quotes that mention it as well, so you can see how it links to that, of course. But this was so much fun. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up, Martha?
No, I don't think so. Just if people are going to read it, just make sure you check the content warnings. We have covered, I think, all of them, but just in case, it's useful to know.
Yeah, some parts are actually really difficult to read, so just bear that in mind if you are going to pick it up. But yeah, that's everything from us today. Martha, do you want to let people know where they can find you?
Yes, so I'm on Instagram at Martha Bethan Reads, and I post about lots of romance, but proper romance, not romance like the monk claims to be.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. And also coming out this month will be Villain Off. So carrying on with spooky season. I'm really excited about it. Like I said, my favorite month for the podcast is October, because we have such fun episodes to do. But yeah, that's everything from us today, and we will see you in another episode.